Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Williams. I'm one of the Senior Security Services Consultants for Fortra, and I'm joined today with Steve Sisk. Steve, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone.
So today we're going to be discussing the secure deployment of ACS, which has changed dramatically, I would say, since I started doing this, Steve. And we won't talk about how many years ago that was. But why don't you run us through what you're going to talk to us about today?
Okay, so this discussion is going to be centered around the Windows environment, and we're going to look at the install steps and considerations for secure deployment of the ACS product, and we'll look at the customizations and security for ACS that will help you to deploy it in your environment so that it's in its most secure state. So Access Client Solutions replaces the old IBM Access for Windows client, which was very much a Windows-based application, whereas ACS is Java-based, and it runs on most any platform that supports Java. And one of the things we'll talk about today that we haven't previously is the application packages for Windows, Linux, and Mac. We're going to focus on Windows, but there are native application packages for Linux and Mac as well. Now, one of the things is that IBM Access for Windows has been around for a long time. It was introduced in 2012, and one of the concerns around still running that client is that the end of service for that client, including patches, was April 30, 2019. So in the evolution of security threats, there's surely in that span of time been additional exploits derived from that application package. So some of the things to think about when addressing the secure deployment and use of ACS is that it uses different technology, Java, and deployment for the base product of ACS doesn't use a Windows install. It uses JavaScripts or no scripts at all. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And the product can be readily downloaded by anyone. The only thing that's needed is an IBM ID. Used to be some more controls around it, but those are no longer there. And though going through the install, the components that are selected and the functions that are available to the user, those selections don't necessarily control what the user can access. And users can manipulate the configuration file to actually enable more functions than what they were originally be used by multiple users, which was significantly different than the old IBM Access for Windows product.
Yeah, so talking about those deployment differences, what have you really found is the most significant?
So the for ACS, of course, the traditional Windows installer for Access for Windows, and there's a selective component installed. So in other words, if I didn't want some pieces of the client to be installed, I could just not select those. And of course, the program is located in the program files directory, which a lot of organizations control what can be introduced or removed from the program files directory. In contrast, you can use the JavaScript installer for ACS, which is different than the Access for Windows, or you can use no installer at all. In fact, you can just unzip the file that comes from IBM and go in and either launch the ACS bundle.jar file or go launch the ACS launch Windows Windows executable, and there's no install required whatsoever. And all of the components are installed, so all the functions are available to the user. They're not restricted by the installer. And the product is actually located in a user path, and that's either in public or in the individual's user's path. Additionally, what's also different here is that with IBM I Access for Windows, the ODBC drivers and which is the most common component, was included with IBM I Access for Windows. And today in ACS, that's broken out into application packages for those platforms that we mentioned earlier, Windows, Linux, and Mac. And it still uses the traditional Windows installer, and that part of the product is still located in program files, but they are two distinct packages to install.
Great. And anyone, if you have questions going through the different subject matters, don't hesitate to add your questions. We'll be monitoring those and either answer them as we're going along, or we'll catch them at the end of the presentation. So we've kind of talked about the deployment differences. So you've mentioned two of the deployment types. I think there's a third that we're not going to cover today.
Yeah, so believe it or not, you can put Access Client Solutions on a USB stick and have a fully functional product. But we're not going to cover that today, as that's a very rare implementation, and probably only administrators would use that type of implementation.
So let's dive into the desktop, since this is probably the most common.
Mm-hmm. So the product and user-specific files are on the desktop, and that's in contrast to the server. The default locations are in the user's directory, and you'll see there by those two paths that one is the product files, which is the actual executables and the main part of the product, and the other is the user files. So all the emulator configurations, transfer definitions, SQL code, all those different parts that are user created. The preferred product location, however, is in the public user directory. And the reason being for that is when you do maintenance to update ACS, it's much easier to have a known location versus having to go and discover, if you got a multi-user PC, what users have it installed, and then going and finding all those images to update those. And again, the two products here, we're talking about the main Java application, and that has a different update strategy and method than does the Windows application package. And if you do, the other reason you would need the Windows application package is if you're doing some desktop programming and you want to interface with ACS through APIs, that's also included in the Windows application package. So the desktop installation is run from running from a JavaScript, and based upon the bitness of the JRE that's installed on the desktop, and so that's going to take you through the install of answering the questions, etc. 64-bit Java, if you don't have that deployed in your environment, has better memory management. And the main difference is that with the 32-bit, when the JVM starts up and it tries to allocate memory for ACS or any other application, it wants contiguous memory. And sometimes in our busy environment, our busy desktops, we either don't have enough memory to do that, or the memory is fragmented so much that a contiguous chunk can't be allocated. And 64-bit handles that much better in that it does not require contiguous memory. When you run the install, you may get a security warning. And so just go ahead and click run. I find that quite interesting that you get a security warning while installing a product. And you respond to the message prompts to enable the functions. And then it'll ask you at the end, do you want to have a common place for all the users to find the product files? And yes, you want to answer, and that will ensure that it gets installed in public for you. Okay, so the security challenge here is, as I mentioned before, the functions that are selected during the install process do not prevent access to functions from a security perspective. Do they, for example, or to be able to access things like the virtual control panel and different things like that that only administrators would get access to. Some organizations have chosen to restrict the product directory or even edit the contents of the ACS bundle.jar file, but those can be circumvented. And again, being able to download it from, being able to easily download it or get a copy would circumvent what's in the product directory because to be able to exercise ACS, a product install is not required. It can be exercised right out of the zip file once it's unzipped. And of course, if they did want to run the installer, doesn't use the traditional Windows installer.
Right. So let's see from here what some of your concerns might be when you're making these considerations for deploying ACS or your other software that you might be using for your users to access your IBM-i. So we've got a few answers in here. I'm going to let this run for a minute. So
and you may just be concerned about security of all of the functions and being able to control them consistently.
we've still got some votes coming in here. So it's nice to see that people are thinking about this and have taken some of it into consideration. Give a few more seconds. Looks like getting some more votes in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's take a look and see what everybody said.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So database functions and integrated file systems. So people are paying attention. That's fantastic. And then data transfer. So certainly these are things that we have assisted customers in securing. So let's talk a little bit about that. I don't want us to run out of time for questions at the end here. So let's talk about the real solution.
Yeah. Everybody wants to know what the secret sauce is. Okay, so so controlling functions on the desktop, the best way to do that is through Windows registry keys. It requires administrative privileges to manage, and to keep in mind that it's cumulative with the exclude comps and the include comps property in the ACS config.properties file. And most of the time, I suggest that customers just not even use the controls in the ACS config.properties file just to eliminate confusion if something is or isn't available to a user. You only have one place to go, and that's the registry, Windows registry. Okay, so the way you get to this function is you have to start ACS with administrator privileges. So you right mouse on the desktop icon for ACS and you say run as administrator, and the screen is going to look exactly the same. There's no indicators on the main panel that you're in administrator mode, if you will, in ACS. And then you're going to click edit and preferences. And that's when you're going to see the the difference here is that previously that restrictions tab would not be there. And so what you're going to do is you're going to click all the check boxes here and that you want to restrict. And you might want to select them all initially, and then you want to click the apply button there on the bottom of the list. And don't click OK. That's the important part. It says click OK, but that's at the end. So you hit the export registry file there, and it's going to spit out a registry file that's got registry keys in for all of those items that you just selected to restrict. Now you'll notice here that in the previous slide we selected everything but 5250, which is 5250 emulation, and you'll notice it has a U there, and that U represents unrestricted. All of the other ones have R, and that's restricted. So if you export all of those keys as restricted in your first export, you don't have to do that again. You can just go into this registry file and manipulate the U's and the R's to achieve the controls that are required for a particular set of users. Now, the important thing about this is that controlling features using these registry keys really makes administrating the desktop easier, in that you don't have to worry about manipulating the ACS config.properties file or anything like that. You know, you get a call from the help desk and to the help desk by a user, and they need some additional function, and that's of course approved. Well, all that needs to be done is for the registry key with the correct R's and U's to be pushed down to the desktop and run, and then that user will have those capabilities without having to reinstall the product or manipulate anything inside the ACS config.properties file.
So let's go back over what you've kind of talked about and kind of sum it up for that desktop piece.
Yeah, so you want to use the registry file to restrict the functions, and we just went through how you build that registry file, and you can build it every time. I'm sort of efficient, so so I build it once and manipulate the U's and the R's. You want to install ACS on the desktop, just a normal install, and you can even select all of the functions if you want to, or none of the functions. It really doesn't matter. You can select them all, would probably be the easier way to go, to not include them, and then execute the reg file after the install, and then deploy the standard key store, which we'll talk about later. And that will save you some steps as well in managing your desktop deployment. Okay, server deployment. So there is another option, unlike IBM Access for Windows. You can have a server-based deployment on any file server. So it could be the IBM IFS, it could be a Windows file server, or it could even be Linux with SMB. It really doesn't matter which one you would like to use. The deployment differs a little bit from the desktop, and we don't recommend using the server images for administrators, just for availability of function in case that server were to have an issue that would, leave the administrators without immediate access, and they'd have to do some installing. So one of the ways you can do the server deployment is in images. And basically what that does is you can create an image with the ACS config.properties file with those include and exclude comps in there. And here you can see we built 3 images. One might be just, your standard user there is with just 5250. And then you have some power users, which would be a lesser set that need 5250 data transfer and printer output. And then you might have, developers, etc., that need those other things such as printer output and IFS and be able to run SQL scripts. So you would build these in distinct, you'd have 3 product directories is the notion here. And you would assign, you'd assign via the icons that you put on the desktop, those icons would refer to the appropriate product directory for that user to start the image that they're assigned to. So the install, as I mentioned, is a little bit different. And so you want to copy the contents of the zip file that comes for ACS into a directory, and you want to run the command. And this install is a little bit different in that it's got the /admin config on the back end. And you're going to select to have the files in a common locations and choose the functions you want to include in that image. And then you want to indicate that you want the desktop icons. And basically what this will do is it'll push, when the user runs this, it'll push icons to the desktop that point to the particular image. Of course, that is one method, but the most secure method, again, is to use registry keys. So in using the images, as we in the previous slide, we still have the issue of the user being able to acquire ACS by some other means, be it on a stick or downloading it. And those controls that are on the server would not prevent the user from acquiring the functions from those other images they might acquire. Plus, it doesn't require unique images by function. So instead of having to maintain multiple unique images based upon the functions you want to provide, you can build one and then use the registry keys to control what features and functions the user has, even from the server, as well as those registry keys will control what the user has access to, even if they were to be able to get ACS on a stick, or if they were able to download it and launch it. Those registry keys are going to be controlling what functions are available no matter where that user launches ACS from. And of course, it's the same approach as the desktop. We're speaking about that. You get the ACS installed and implemented, and then you're going to run those registry keys at the last item. Now, one important thing is if you choose to use the multiple images, is that this is a subset of the most popular controls that are, things that you might see in the exclude comps or the include comps property in the ACS config.properties file, is that this only works if that ACS config.properties file is read-only. If the user can access it and manipulate it, then the security is off. And that's another reason to use the registry controls on the desktop to control even the server-based deployment of ACS.
So I know, Steve, when I've been going through these configs and trying to find things, one of the things that's the hardest is knowing where everything is. And I think you talk about that now and in a few following slides too.
Yep. So there's in the server-based deployment, the user files are not on the desktop unless you choose to put them there. You can, but most organizations will have those user files on the server itself, and that is indicated by the ACS based directory property in the ACS properties config.properties file. And there's two choices. One is you can put them inside the product directory, and that's the first option there in the table. And so you would have another directory sitting in the product directory that would contain a directory for each user to contain their particular objects that are particular to them. The other option is to put those configuration user directories in a distinct directory separate from the product. And most organizations choose the latter, to put them in a separate distinct directory, and that allows them to manipulate them or back them up or whatever they'd like to do easier in the long run. So it's just a management issue, but either will work.
So you've talked about, again, a little bit on the different directories and securing the config file and those kind of things. This table kind of sums that up for you on what the recommended authorities are and locations.
Yes.
Make sure that config is as secure as possible. And then if we go through this next slide that you've got, this is kind of an example of that, I think, right?
Yeah, so this is an example of the configuration directory being separate from the product directory, and you can see here how there's the config directory, whatever you want to call it, and then there's the user that sits underneath there, and then you'll see the familiar directory structure that you would see on the desktop in the documents directory, that IBM directory, and then all of the corresponding ACS directories underneath that. So it looks and the content and the looks are the same, whether it's on the desktop or it's on the server, as far as how it works and what's stored in what locations.
So just to sum it up again, because we've gone through the desktop, so wrap this server piece up, and then we're going to dive into some real fun security stuff here in a second.
So you want to create your ACS image if you choose to go down that path and use images, and you're going to as you're doing the install in a particular image directory, you're going to select the functions you want to be available to the user, but then if you're going to use the registry keys, you only need to do that one time, and you can select nothing and then enable those, and then you're going to create the user configuration directory, and then you're going to secure the ACS files and directories based upon that table that we saw earlier. And then you're going to add the location of the configuration directory as well as the location of the common SSL key store into the ACS config.properties file for that particular image. So the process is, and then of course, just like with the desktop, if you're going to use the registry keys, then as you do the installs on the desktop, you're going to run that reg file to control the access to the functions.
And as promised, we're going to deep dive into TLS, SSL. Everybody's favorite conversation these days is making sure that data in flight is actually encrypted. So how does ACS make this better than what we did before?
Well, better may be a stretch. Different is probably a better term to use. So the thing about the common certificate store is this provides some advantages for from an administrative and management perspective. And that is, first of all, instead of the user having to worry about loading the certificates into the appropriate certificate store and then going through the acceptance dialog and not knowing what that is and calling the help desk, the certificates can be preloaded into the certificate stores and then distributed as a part of the installation. So for ACS, and this would apply to the server as well, you can, I'm sorry, you can put those in a common location. On the desktop, we recommend in the public IBM security directory, which is one you would have to create, but with read-only access. And that is because users don't need to manipulate that the certificate store on the desktop or on the server, and inside the properties file, there's a certificate cert file property that lets you designate where that CA cert certificate store is for the ACS client. With the Windows application package, it's a little bit different in that it still uses the traditional certificate store from the old IBM I Access for Windows client. However, the thing that's different is that there is no management interface into those two files directly. You go into the key store, into the key management function of ACS, and you select the certificate that you want to implement into the Windows application package, and there's a button that says export to Windows. And it's not really exporting it to Windows, it's exporting it into the two files that you see into the key store that's made up of the two files you see there on the screen. And it has a standard location.
Coming out and the new navigator, it is all about function usage.
Yeah. So in whether it's in the old application administrator or the function usage, the controls that are in there that control the client functions, they apply to ACS exactly the same. And if you have existing functions controls either in function usage or in application administrator, then ACS is going to adhere to those controls just like your users with IBM I Access for Windows. You can also manipulate those through the green screen through the work function usage command, which has the same controls, just not through the GUI.
So with that, let's launch our last poll that we've got here and see, are you interested in actually changing the way you've deployed ACS? Have you already deployed it securely? And getting your environment a little bit more managed, I will say. And I think ACS, and the way that IBM's done this, it's made it more manageable, at least from a administrator's perspective, than the previous iteration, I'll call it.
Yeah,
So we'll
back
leave
in the
that open
day,
for a little bit.
back in the day when I would go to my desktop folks and say, "Hey, we got to push another service pack or a new version of the IBM Access for Windows." I had to wear Kevlar. That was
Oh
just the
yeah,
way.
it was a good negotiation. So it looks like everybody's voted. So let me close that and bring that up. So it looks like a lot of people are. So we've got 62% that said yes, 10 that no, so you may not be using ACS, because I know we had some out there. And then 28% just aren't sure. And if you're not sure because it sounds complicated, always sounds more complicated until you start doing it. And I can attest to that, because I know Steve and I have gone through this a number of times with different customers, and having those different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So as some additional references, because we're not going to leave here empty-handed, we will have all these links available for you. I don't know if you want to go through any of these, Steve, in any detail.
No, not details. Some of them point to some older articles, but the principles are still the same. You might have more options. For example, from several years ago when ACS came out till now, there's more controls and
Oh yeah,
more controls than there used to be, as far as the individual functions that you can restrict, etc. So, but as far as the approach, those should all be valid. Now, one of the things I do want to mention is when you get your follow-up from this webinar, there's going to be a link to a white paper that is takes you through all of the things we've talked about here today in detail. So be sure to download that, and you can use that for your reference to maybe answer some questions or guide you through the process a little bit more in detail.
absolutely. So just to let everybody know, certainly ACS was our focus today, but with the IBM I and Fortress breadth of solutions that we have, our group, the security solutions, security services consultant engineers, they keep changing our titles, and I'm going to continue to mess it up, so we'll leave it at that one. But we go full life cycle for your systems, right? From vulnerability assessments to helping with intrusion protection, compliance and audit reporting, which we have services for. If you want to start encrypting your data in place or in flight, we have solutions for you. Virus protection, we talked about the IFS. It was one of the number one things that you guys are concerned about access is into the integrated file system. And that's the window that viruses come in through for the IBM I. Identification and access management. So really managing your user profiles, managing that life cycle, making sure people are on the system that should be on the system, and when they don't need that access anymore, making sure that they don't have it. Secured managed file transfer. So really going away from FTP and moving into more of a managed system that can use SSH, SFTP, HTTPS, and those types of things. And then when looking at your systems, we all generally have some regulation or rules or controls that we need to be adhering by. So managing those security policies, and then along with that, monitoring that those policies are being followed with the integrity monitoring. So from the professional security services side, we have our managed security services, which provides not only that yearly vulnerability risk assessment, but also monthly reporting on 15 key factors that you want to be monitoring. We have a service to help you get single sign-on configured on your IBM I and integrate that with Active Directory so that you don't have to manage passwords anymore because they're the enemy. If you're looking for remediation because you just don't know where your system's at and you need help getting there, we're certainly more than happy to help you with that. That's probably the most fun we get to have. Mention the risk assessments because that is also a one-off. If you just want to know where your system's at against best practices and what the recommendations are, having one of our risk assessments done will really pull back the layers of where your system configurations might not be quite as secure as you thought they were. We also perform penetration testing, and our version is a white box penetration test. So we basically play the role of a user that's well informed and just too curious, and we find out just how well your controls that you've put in place are working for you. And then in architecture, we will help you build out that entire security plan for you and what the next steps are, how you should take those next steps, and what priority they should be done in. So that's the Fortra wrap up. So do we have we've got one question out there, Steve, and I think you've done this before, working with customers, maybe not done it yourself, but the question was, how can this be deployed through either MECM or SCCM silently, since it doesn't use the traditional Windows installer? And if you don't know, we will.
So I can speak in general, is that we do work with customers on how to deploy through desktop software management products. It might be a bit easier than you could imagine, but yes, there are customers out there that we've helped to deploy and maintain ACS through their desktop software management products.
And then one of the other questions, and we get this a lot, is there really an advantage to the desktop deployments versus the server deployments? Have you seen one's really better than the other?
Well, I think it's it's primarily an emotional constraint. So, you know, I know things that I run off my desktop, I feel a little bit more warm and fuzzy about running it off my desktop versus a server. But, you know, there's the one thing that I would say is the number one concern of customers is the availability of that server. So if you have, you know, good redundancy in your environment, where if your primary file server goes down, there's another one to take its place, and you know it's going to be a blip on the screen as far as an interruption, then there's not much difference between the two. One thing that does occur that is a little bit different is when ACS is run from the server, when it's first initiated, it downloads the Java code into a cache on the desktop. And so sometimes that first load can be a bit slow. Okay. Yeah. But that only occurs once or until the ACS is updated on the server to the new version.
Okay. We've got a few more questions out here. Question is, some users remotely got the new ACS installed with the 5250 sessions, and the user ID and password are being saved. So every time they're doing an IPL, the sessions are getting a sign-on to the system.